Myles Garrett asked out of Cleveland. I want you to actually let that land before we go any further, because I think the speed of the news cycle has prevented people from feeling the full weight of it. Not a backup player angling for more snaps. Not a mid-level contributor chasing a bigger contract on a better roster. The best defensive player in professional football. A man who just broke the NFL's single-season sack record in a performance so dominant that defensive coordinators are still studying it, trying to understand how you even prepare for someone like that. Sat down across from Rich Eisen, composed and deliberate, and told the entire football world that the direction Cleveland is heading no longer matches what he came here to build. I've been watching this league for a long time. I've seen disgruntled stars. I've seen trade requests manufactured by agents and amplified by media cycles. What I watched in that interview was different. And the difference is the thing I can't stop thinking about. What stayed with me wasn't what Garrett said, it was how he said it. There's a version of this where a frustrated player vents, where the emotion bleeds through the careful language, where you can sense a part of him still hoping the organization picks up the phone and says the right thing. Garrett wasn't that. He was calm in the specific way someone is calm when they've already finished grieving something. When the internal decision has been made weeks ago, and the public statement is simply the last procedural step. I've spent enough time around professional football to know the difference between a man who's angry and a man who's concluded something. Myles Garrett had concluded. And conclusions, unlike frustrations, don't reverse themselves when circumstances shift slightly. Understanding why this matters requires understanding who Myles Garrett actually is, not just as a defensive force, but as a human being, because most of the national conversation around this story has flattened him into the generic archetype of the disgruntled star and completely missed the point. This is a man who sculpts, who reads poetry, who approaches every major decision in his life with a philosophical deliberateness that is rare at any level of professional life, let alone inside an NFL locker room. He doesn't speak carelessly, he doesn't react impulsively. When Myles Garrett makes a public statement about his relationship with a franchise, it arrives at the end of a process that takes months, not days, one that involves exhaustive private consideration and the honest evaluation of every possible alternative. What he told Rich Eisen was not a shot fired in frustration. It was a door being closed quietly and permanently by someone who had already spent significant time looking for every reason to keep it open. So how does a player like that, a player who restructured his own contract to give this organization more financial flexibility, who committed his peak years to a city with no championship tradition on the genuine belief that the right people could build something real, arrive at this particular destination? The media coverage has mostly fixated on the trade request itself, without tracing the road that led there. And the road is the real story. The fracture begins with Jim Schwartz. That's where it starts if you're being precise about the timeline. Schwartz built the Cleveland defense into something genuinely dominant, and his working relationship with Garrett wasn't the manufactured warmth of a coach managing a star. It was actual mutual respect constructed through shared work and honest communication over time. When the head coaching vacancy opened, Garrett wasn't privately hoping Schwartz would get the job. He was publicly advocating for him, putting his personal credibility on the line because he believed that deeply in what they'd built together and in Schwartz's capacity to take it further. And then Todd Monken was hired. I'm not here to argue that Monken was the wrong choice on his merits. That's a separate conversation. What I'm saying is that watching his explicit public endorsement get passed over created something in Garrett's relationship with this organization that didn't heal cleanly. Not bitterness, something quieter. A question whether the people at the top were genuinely listening to those who understood the football reality from the inside, or whether there was a structural gap between what the people closest to the game believed and what the decision maker ultimately chose. That question, once planted, doesn't disappear. It becomes the lens through which every subsequent organizational decision gets filtered. Then there was Watson. I'm not going to relitigate the full saga because the football reality of that contract has been obvious to anyone willing to look at it honestly for years. What matters here is what that decision communicated to a player who had already made a real personal financial sacrifice on the belief that the organization was thinking at a championship level. Garrett watched the entire Watson process from inside the building. The people with genuine proximity to him during that period don't describe his reaction as outrage or explosive frustration. They describe something far more corrosive, a quiet, patient, accumulating disbelief. The kind that doesn't erupt. It solidifies slowly until it becomes the permanent background against which you interpret every organizational move that follows. Once that kind of disbelief goes quiet inside someone with Garrett's analytical intelligence, it doesn't dissolve. It calcifies. It becomes the new baseline, and suddenly patterns emerge that you couldn't see before, or maybe didn't want to see. This brings me to the ownership dynamic, because it's the thread that surfaces in every honest conversation about how Cleveland actually operates as an organization. The consistent picture drawn by people with genuine proximity to that building is of a structural gap between what the football staff evaluates and recommends and what the decision maker at the top ultimately chooses to do. The football people do their work. They reach conclusions. Those conclusions move through the organization, and then decisions arrive that don't reliably reflect what the people who actually understand the game have been communicating. For most players, that gap exists in the abstract. They feel its effects without being able to trace the specific mechanism. For someone with 8 years inside that organization and Garrett's level of analytical attention, the anatomy becomes visible. You stop just seeing that decisions are going wrong. You understand precisely why, which mechanism is failing, whose instincts are being overridden, and by whose preferences. And once you understand the mechanism, you also understand that no coaching hire, no draft selection, no free agent signing addresses it, because the problem isn't at that level. The problem is structural. The problem is at the top. Here is the detail that got buried under the volume of noise surrounding the trade request, and it tells you more about where Garrett's head truly was than anything he said publicly. Before he went to the media, he called LeBron James. Not his agent, not a teammate, not a business partner. LeBron. Take a moment with that. Garrett sought out the one person on earth with the most direct, lived experience of what it actually costs to conclude that the championship window you sacrificed years to build cannot exist in the city where you've been building it, and who came out the other side and found something real elsewhere. He was preparing. He was asking what the transition feels like from someone who had already paid that exact price. You do not make that phone call out of frustration. You make it when the internal work is already complete and you're getting ready for what comes after. That call is not the action of a man still searching for a resolution. It is a man walking toward a door that is already open, pausing to ask someone he trusts whether it's safe to step through. Then Andrew Berry stepped to the podium. An NFL front office language requires translation, so let me offer some. Berry acknowledged Garrett's significance to the franchise. He confirmed awareness of the situation without providing specifics that could lock the organization into a position they hadn't chosen. He deployed the carefully calibrated vocabulary of someone coached by legal and communications professionals to appear responsive while structurally committing to nothing. What I was listening for, and what I did not hear, was resolution. What I heard was the measured calm of someone buying time, hoping the temperature drops before the next pressure point arrives, managing a situation in real time while keeping all options technically open. And the fundamental problem with that approach is that the person whose temperature you're trying to manage has already demonstrated, categorically and publicly, that he sees directly through exactly that kind of language. You cannot cool down a conclusion with careful corporate phrasing. A conclusion is immune to communication strategy. Now I want to talk about Shedeur Sanders because his story has been almost entirely consumed by the organizational turbulence surrounding him. And that's unfair to what he's actually doing inside all of this. Think carefully about the environment he walked into. Watson still physically present in the facility, his situation unresolved and generating daily noise. A national media narrative that had already formed rigid opinions before Shedeur took a single professional snap. Opinions shaped by the draft process, by his father, by everything except the only thing that actually matters, which is what kind of football player he is. A fan base divided between cautious hope and deep exhaustion. A locker room still recalibrating after a significant regime change. That is the environment this young quarterback stepped into on day one. And his response to every single one of those pressures has been the same, consistent and unmistakable. Get in before everyone else, work harder than the moment requires, and refuse, absolutely refuse, to let the external noise infect what happens inside that building. He hasn't given interviews seeking sympathy. He hasn't lobbied publicly for his starting job. He hasn't tried to manage his image through calculated accessibility or locker room politics. He has just been relentlessly, quietly, demonstrably present. And I want to be specific about why that matters, because "he works hard" is the kind of phrase that gets absorbed as generic athletic cliche. What Shedeur is actually demonstrating is far more specific and far more rare. The capacity to maintain full professional commitment and complete internal focus inside a genuinely dysfunctional organizational environment without letting any of that dysfunction crack his preparation. That particular quality, insulating your internal standard from external chaos, is one of the most important separators between quarterbacks who survive their first NFL season and the ones who get consumed by the environment around them. It cannot be installed by a coaching staff. It cannot be built in a week of intensive work. Either it is part of how you are put together or it isn't. And from everything described about Shedeur Sanders inside that facility each morning, it is demonstrably, visibly, and repeatedly there. And Myles Garrett has seen it. This is the part I find most revealing about this entire situation. Garrett, simultaneously the most respected voice in that locker room and the person most publicly considering leaving the organization, has been one of Shedeur's most vocal internal advocates since the moment he arrived, not in the vague, non-committal way that costs a veteran nothing, specifically and concretely. He has spoken about Shedeur arriving before coaches are in the building, about film sessions at hours when the rest of the roster is nowhere near the facility, about a maturity of preparation that commands genuine respect from veterans who have watched a long procession of NFL quarterbacks come through and fail in ways both spectacular and quiet, coming from the single most credible voice in that building. Credibility earned through years of real performance, not organizational status. That level of specific, concrete endorsement sends an unmistakable signal to everyone else in the locker room. The evaluation has already been made by the people who are actually there every day, and the conclusion isn't complicated or contested, it's settled, which makes the organizational hesitation around the Watson situation, the continued deliberate ambiguity, the refusal to make a clean public declaration, all the more staggering to consider. Because what that ambiguity communicates to everyone watching from inside that building isn't careful organizational management. It communicates the exact same structural dynamic that has been eroding trust for years. The football people see clearly what should happen. The decision maker at the top is preserving flexibility that no one else believes serves the organization's actual interests. Same pattern, different names, different situation, same result. Mandatory minicamp carries a weight far beyond any normal roster evaluation checkpoint this year. It has become a deadline, a pressure test for every unresolved tension currently running through this organization simultaneously. If Garrett's situation is still publicly ambiguous when that date arrives, if there's still no clear organizational declaration about Shedeur, if Watson's presence continues requiring the football staff to navigate around uncertainty, then Cleveland walks into training camp carrying a weight that no coaching talent or roster quality can compensate for once the real work begins. Organizational dysfunction isn't a contained fire. It spreads into meetings, film rooms, locker room conversations, and individual performances in ways that can't be measured and can't be managed after a certain threshold. The specific combination of people and talent and organizational possibility that exists right now in Cleveland will not wait indefinitely. The clock is running. Everyone inside that building knows it. What makes this genuinely painful to analyze is that the actual ingredients for something real are present in Cleveland right now, not theoretically, concretely. The offensive infrastructure has been rebuilt with real intention and real investment. The coaching vision is legitimate. Myles Garrett at full engagement remains the most disruptive defensive force in professional football, and a young quarterback whose preparation has earned internal respect through the only method that actually earns it, by showing up and doing the work before anyone requires him to. That roster, stripped of the organizational noise currently suffocating it, has real potential for the first time in years. That's what makes this moment so genuinely difficult to sit with, because potential doesn't wait. It exists in specific windows, with specific people at specific stages of their careers. When those windows close because the people with authority to act couldn't make decisions when the evidence was pointing clearly, they don't return on the same terms. The resolution isn't mechanically complicated. It never was. The difficulty isn't in identifying what should happen. The difficulty is in the will to actually do it. Commit to Shedeur Sanders, fully, publicly, without managed language that preserves organizational escape hatches. Give him the platform his work has already earned in the eyes of the people who see him every morning. And in doing that, give Myles Garrett something he hasn't had in a very long time. A genuine reason to look at the direction of this franchise and see something meaningfully different from the pattern he has been watching for 8 years. Because this was never really about a player wanting to leave. That's the headline version. The real story is about a man who gave his absolute best for years to an organization he genuinely believed in, watched it repeatedly make decisions that undermined what he was working toward, and is now using the only language that ownership structures actually respond to in order to ask one fundamental question: is anyone with real decision-making authority in this building finally willing to make choices worthy of the players they've been fortunate enough to have? The window for answering that question is not infinite, and the people who hold the power to answer it are running out of time to do so before the answer no longer matters.